atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon, Jay. How are you doing?
Well, disappointed that the conference committee has said I am no longer a nominee. So,
well, you'll always
but
be.
I'll move on.
you'll always be a nominee to me, Jay. So we have, of course, we're going to be talking about nominees and speakerships and all kinds of other stuff. The conflict between Israel and Hamas, and well, there's a bunch more we're going to get to. But before we do get to anything, I want to issue, well, I guess I'll call it what it is, and it's an apology. A few weeks ago, Jay, you and I were discussing continuing support for Ukraine, especially in the context of what I believe is increasing Republican reluctance to continue on with that funding, at least in some areas of the party. I don't think you disagree with me on that.
Sure, yeah.
But and so you made the point that you could make a reasonable case to conservatives for why Republicans should keep on supporting Ukraine. And I agreed it was a reasonable case, but I didn't think it was a winning message because to me, it seemed like it was out of touch with, I guess I'll call it the increasing nativism, isolationism, and kind of the non-Jay Carson wing of the party, which is
that's what they call them.
I think so. The
non-Carson wing of the Republican Party.
But and then I said, well, maybe there could be a compromise if Democrats were willing to give Republicans something on immigration in return. And then I kind of went on from there to suggest that Congress is full of narcissistic psychopaths in both parties, and I stand by that remark in general, though maybe full of is a bit much. And I'll amend that remark to say, I think it's likely there are a disproportionate number of narcissists and psychopaths in Congress relative to the population as a whole. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's kind of where I'm at on that. So
I can see narcissists. Psychopaths might be a little strong.
Okay, semi-psychopaths maybe, but all right. But anyway,
no, I'm not saying there are no psychopaths, but
certainly not. But by then, I got myself kind of worked up. And hey, I do that from time to time. And then I said this. I said, it's not going to be based on principles of any sort. It's going to be based on a sort of hardball. I really like more people at the border to ideally harass. And hey, if you could, shoot a few brown people, that's good too. That was uncalled for, And even if there are more than a few narcissistic psychopaths amongst congressional Republicans and congressional Democrats, none of them, as far as I know, is in favor of shooting brown people, as I put it. And so that was over the line. I apologize. And I really appreciate our listener and supporter, the Poopsicle on Discord, calling me out on it and making me really think about it. My first reaction was sort of try to explain it, be a little bit defensive. But the more I thought about it, the more I said, no, that's not okay. And I wanted to make that and my apology for that a front and center. So thank you, Poopsicle. And I will keep that in mind and try to do better in the future. All right. So let's move on to our main story, or at least our top story. On October 7th, not quite 2 weeks ago, Hamas launched a major surprise attack on Israel. And last week, I think Trey put together a really solid historical perspective on the conflict, which of course dates back well over a century. And he and Ken discussed the initial response of Israel. And in this last week, there have been a number of significant developments in a conflict which already thousands of deaths and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza. President Biden went to Israel this week, and in remarks given in Tel Aviv, he said, Hamas committed atrocities that recall the worst ravages of ISIS, unleashing pure, unadulterated evil upon the world. There's no rationalizing it, no excusing it, period. And he also said that the U.S. would provide Israel with whatever it needed to defend itself. But he also cautioned Israel, saying, while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. And while we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. Then on his trip back to Washington, Biden said he'd help negotiate an agreement to open a crossing from Egypt to allow aid into Gaza. And that's, though, still being worked out between negotiators. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime in the immediate future, though hopefully as soon as possible. And in a national address from the Oval Office on Thursday, that's yesterday, we're recording this on Friday, Biden linked the conflicts in Israel with the conflict in Ukraine, saying American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it. And he also ended up today, actually, sending an urgent budget request to Congress to support Israel and Ukraine, $106 billion in funding, including $14 billion for Israel, $61 billion for Ukraine, which, if approved, would be enough, projected at least to be enough to be a full year's worth of funding, around $14 billion in immigration, $10 billion on humanitarian aid, and also some additional funding to counter China's influence in Asia and developing countries elsewhere in the world. So, Jay, there's a lot, and this is even before the expected, almost inevitable, I would say, Israeli ground offensive into Gaza. I thought we'd start with a big question. Do you think that the Gazans are rightfully angry with Israel? And if they are, how do you think this should affect the U.S. and Israel's response to Hamas's attack?
Well, I'm not sure when you're saying rightfully angry. Are we talking about going back to original grievances or 1948, or are we talking about events since the last week?
I think you can look at it any way you want.
All the above.
Yeah, all the above. Yeah.
I think it's fine for people of a nation or region, population, whatever, to be angry with those it disagrees with or who it sees as oppressing them. It's something else entirely to say to as a result of that support barbarism. So I think it's. Yeah, can you say somebody's justifiably angry? I suppose, but I think Biden is actually, I'll give credit where credit's due. That whatever the grievance is, it can never justify the type of action that Hamas took. So I guess I'd separate the Anger's one thing. It's
but that would work. Then that would work both ways. Then, if in responding to Hamas's atrocity, Israeli forces ended up committing atrocities of their own, that the same logic would apply, right?
Yeah. No, I would say you're never in favor of atrocities, right?
That is never justified by any end.
Yeah. But if you look at the position that Israel has been put in, where Hamas has discouraged people from evacuating, routinely uses hostages and civilians as human shields, seeks propaganda victories through this sort of that sort of thing of putting civilians in harm's way. And understanding that there will be civilian, and I want to draw a clear line between civilian casualties, collateral casualties, and atrocities, right? If you're fighting a war and you try to bomb a target and there are human shields there and they're killed, that those are civilians' deaths, and that's regrettable. It's a tragedy, but I don't see that as an atrocity. Gunning down innocent people in their home and cutting the heads off babies, those are atrocities, right? So I'd want to draw that line between there. That listen, certainly there are going to be civilian deaths, probably a large number of civilian deaths. Innocent men, women, children, old people killed in the days going forward. And I think that's part of the horrors of war. But I think it's also different than to say, when you're intentionally seeking out to target civilians and the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that distinction. I think that's a really good one. What do you? I mean, clearly Hamas. There are some very intelligent people who are in charge in Hamas. They were able to plan this thing, catching Israeli security forces, it seems like, completely by surprise. And so you have to wonder what Hamas expected to get. They had to have expected this sort of response. And there's this questioning now as whether or not Israel is giving them exactly what they were hoping for. What do you think about that?
Maybe. I can't, read their minds. It could be the Hamas playbook is sort of exactly that. Have the Israelis come back and hit hard, and they have to. And Hamas is counting on the support of the world for Israel to dry up in short order as soon as those civilian casualties, whether accidental or intentional, by putting them in harm's way, occur. So again, I'm going to give credit to where credit's due to President Biden for going to Israel and making a strong show of support on that. I think most of what he said was spot on, and in fact, those are some of the better things he said throughout his entire presidency. Right, in terms of American world leadership, I'm with him there. Where I do think there were kind of clunkers are this sort of it just seems advising someone else in their time of mourning, as it were, and this to say, well, but careful, don't go overboard. I think that just kind of hit a false note.
Well, I wonder about that. I'm thinking about that on a personal level. When you see a good friend who's, I wouldn't call it mourning, I would say a good friend who, for whatever reason, is enraged about something, and you see him getting ready to bludgeon somebody, and you can understand that feeling. But if you are a true friend, you hold him back and say,
Bob, what kind of friends do you hang out with, Mike? Bludgeoning people.
Well, I don't know why that came to my mind. But you see my point. And I like the fact that Biden also took time to acknowledge Palestinian grievances. He said he's heartbroken by the tragic loss of Palestinian life, and that we can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity. Because I think it's so easy to be so reflexively one-sided on this. And I feel like President Biden struck a good balance there.
I see. Again, that's where I disagree, because I do think there are times when you ought to be reflexively one-sided, and this would be one of them. And whatever grievances the Gazans or the Palestinian people may have, now is not the time to bring them up or address them, if you follow me, because it almost by doing so, it validates the strategy.
See, I guess I see what you're saying, but I think I have a fundamental disagreement, because what I think what I think Hamas wants is they want a ground invasion. They want a long and bloody insurgency that's going to, over time, make Israeli forces look like brutal occupiers and, rally world opinion against them, and basically destroy any fleeting hope of a sort of a greater rapprochement between Israel and other Middle Eastern countries, like we're trying to work out with Saudi Arabia. And that's why I think if we assume that Hamas leadership is smart and strategic, and I think that's a reasonable assumption, then I feel like Israel is maybe falling into the trap is a wrong way to put it, but Israel has been put into an untenable no-win situation by some very clever, very brutal people in Hamas.
Yeah. Well, and I would also, but by the same token, I don't think the Israelis are dumb. And if you and I can pick up on this, certainly they can as well. And I think that would, the Israelis, I think, have done the right things. I mean, both politically and morally, ethically, by saying, "Hey, you need to evacuate. We're coming in. We're going to give you the time to evacuate." By not, jumping straight out and hitting civilian populations. So I think the Israelis are doing
well.
What they can to avoid falling into that trap, but to some extent, they're not going to control the media narrative, like what happened with the hospital, right? I mean,
well, that certainly may be part of it, but another part of it is there are reports that Israeli commanders say that they don't have nearly munitions supplies or the logistical support in place that they would have to launch a successful ground invasion yet, when they believe it's going to be months, if not longer than that. And so what might look like a humanitarian pause may also have really big elements of making sure they have as much force and as much reserves amassed as possible to go in there and clean things out. And I think that's part of it. We also
and both can obviously be true. But that, I guess, doesn't discount, taking the steps of telling the civilian population to evacuate.
Well, yeah, but yeah, and so that
right.
Is,
I mean, otherwise you could just wait and tell them, "Hey, stay there. We're not invading for another, couple months," and then.
Sure. I mean, I understand the reluctance of Israel to just open up a border for humanitarian aid when the details of who's going to be checking for weapons and whether or not Hamas can get control. I mean, these are things that take some time to work out. And so I hope that a big part of Israel's calculus is a humanitarian calculus, and that and that's something you obviously believe.
I would say even if it's not humanitarian calculus, even if it's just pure political calculus, to hold on to world opinion, right? I mean, I still think it's the right move.
Yeah, and John in the comments here is joining us. We have some listeners, supporters joining us. Just pointed out a similar thing, saying that messaging by Israel is really key to their long-term success here, and I certainly agree with that comment. Yeah, it's clear to me that right now we're further from a two-state solution than we've been in a while. And for folks who don't know maybe what that term means, it's that idea of the Palestinians actually having a state, all right? And there are something like, I think, over 5 million Palestinians who are, in effect, stateless and have been stateless for generations, really, at this point. And I wonder, Jay, what you even think about a two-state solution. Is that something that's just not even just like, is that just totally, completely unrealistic? Or is that a goal that we should bother even considering at this point, long term?
Yeah. Now, look, I'm not a Middle East expert by any means, right? So I want to qualify that, because things, I'm enough of an expert to say that things there are extremely complicated, and much more complicated than are portrayed on the news, or can even easily be portrayed on the news, right? There are, when you say the Palestinians, there are variations within the Palestinians and the Arab world of where they stand on these questions, and what religious traditions they're coming from, and then there's class issues and ethnic issues and all sorts of layers upon layers. That said, I don't see there being a two-state solution on the table anymore.
I mean, and we're talking, I would say, not for a generation at least. Yeah. So but clearly, at least to me, that has been Israel's plan all along. I mean, we take a look at the settlements in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights since that war in 1967, a long time ago, right? There are something like over 700,000 Israeli settlers in the occupied territories, which the UN views as, a violation of international law. These were I would say, pretty clearly designed to make it more difficult for there to be a Palestinian state. And I wonder if you agree with that.
I don't know. I think there's a couple things going on there. One, I think to ascribe it to a long-term plan to prevent a Palestinian state, I don't know if that's the case. I think sometimes these things are planned, and maybe they're planned for other reasons. So yeah, I'm not going to try to get in the head of, what the Israelis have done for, the last 50 years, other than to say they want, a Jewish homeland that is secure. And they have seen, putting settlements out there as a way to increase their security. I think the problem, with a two-state solution, and again, various variations of that have been proposed by Israel a number of times, and they've been typically rejected by the Palestinians, who insist on the full right to return. And I think that's just not in the cards. And I think, look, given what we're seeing, if that other state were created, would it, in all likelihood, simply declare war on Israel immediately? So I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure how to answer that question, right? As far as what's Israel's long-term strategy, I don't know. I mean,
I think
did some of these have that effect? Yeah, I think you can make that argument.
Yeah, I would go further. I don't disagree with any of that. I would go further to say that, in general, Israel has been, at least the ruling governments in Israel, have been opposed to a Palestinian state for various reasons. And I have, again, I want to emphasize that I absolutely understand how Israelis are feeling, because I remember how I felt after 9/11. And so, to your point, yeah, I didn't want to hear about nuanced arguments about history and that sort of thing right away, at least. But President Biden's right. We did make some mistakes, and they were mistakes that ended up being, I think, very costly. And so, to the extent to which we can try to provide the benefit of our hard-earned experience in prestige, in blood, to our allies in Israel, well, that's doing a favor to our friends.
Well, but is it? I guess I would ask about the medium. Is that something that Biden could have said to Netanyahu privately?
Yeah, and I'm sure he has. I mean,
announcing it, but rather than announcing it in public, right? I think there's a difference there.
Well, I think also, there's a significant portion of the public, particularly on the Democratic side, that is very sympathetic to Palestinians and feels that U.S. policy for a long time has been too reflexively pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian. And so I don't think that he could just not say anything about that. And in the context of his overall remarks, it was a pretty small segment of that, more than the Republicans.
And I think I was being fair when I said, look, I think most of what he said was really good and on point. That's the only, again, part that I think I would say hit a wrong note for me.
Gotcha. So you don't disagree that we should care about the humanity of Palestinians, just that it was not the right time to say that.
Exactly. Yeah. Not the right time nor place nor way to present it.
And domestically, John raised a good point here that this puts Netanyahu in an interesting position, because, of course, he was fairly unpopular. He's had his Trumpian-esque sort of legal troubles, and they've been involved in a big attempt to remake the judiciary in a way to kind of give them more authority or give the judiciary less authority. And Netanyahu's whole thing has been very hard line, very kind of peace through strength, or, annihilating your enemies through strength and that sort of thing. And this right now, at least, has kind of put those concerns to the side. But long term, if Israel isn't able to effectively deal with this, it could potentially hurt him even more.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there may be, again, they formed the unity government for purposes of this war, and I think that's smart and appropriate. Down the line, I think there's going to be questions asked appropriately about why didn't we see this coming? Why didn't we do more? that sort of thing, right? And I think now is not the time to ask those questions, but those questions will be and should be asked later. And we'll see where Netanyahu and his people are on that, right? I mean, I think there could be the argument that because of all this other stuff, they took their eye off the ball. I don't know that that's a fair criticism, right? Because you can say, look, I can argue about judicial reforms and still be, have, the intelligence services still ought to be able to see, terrorist plots coming.
Well, just like in the U.S., when after the fact we did a very deep analysis of what happened with our failures of communications and intelligence integration, and I'm sure the Israelis will do the same thing. So, moving back to the domestic scene, what do you think about the various pro-Palestinian groups on college campuses and other places issuing statements that put the blame on Israel? I mean, the big statement, right, was the Harvard groups saying that the blame for this was, the Israeli regime is entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. What's your reaction to that? And then the reaction to that sort of thing?
I think that's, statements like that I think are abominable. I'm deeply troubled that that's the state of our discourse on campus. But to some extent, it's been sort of fostered for years, right? There's sort of this blind eye that you're allowed to say stuff when it comes to Israel about like that. So no, I'm disheartened that that many students would do that. That so many universities would be wishy-washy on this and say, well, I imagine, like, think back, Mike, to if this were 1939, right, and Kristallnacht happened, and commentators said, yeah, but there's debates to be had on both sides, really, and yeah, they shouldn't have done, the Germans shouldn't, Nazis shouldn't be doing all that, but there are issues out there. I mean, wouldn't we look at that and say that's completely morally?
I would disagree with the analogy
kind of view,
because I think Kristallnacht was a very, very different thing, and the Jews that were the horrible stuff that happened to those Jews, those folks were not in any way, shape, or form could be considered colonialist oppressors of a people.
No, but that's certainly not the view that the Nazis would have had. And that's not the view that others on the right.
But it's not an unreasonable view. Time. I'm saying that. And so I understand what you're saying. I'm just rejecting your analogy. I mean, because especially in
I would argue that it's tough to say that the babies that were beheaded were colonizers or even would even
right. But that's not what that statement was saying. That statement was saying none of this would have happened had Israel not had the policies that it had concerning Gaza. Now, that may be an entirely wrong statement. I disagree with that largely, almost entirely. Certainly, I disagree wholly.
Let's put it this way. I would say a lot of these folks, if you go back to 1948, they wanted to kill Jews before they got there. So, yeah.
What? Sorry, you lost me there.
What I'm saying, I think the anti-Semitism that you see in Hamas is not something that just came up because of Israeli policies. It's something that's always been there. Perhaps Israeli policies haven't helped it, but in some respects, perhaps the Israelis' policies were a reaction to it.
There's an element that I think it's reasonable to say there's an element of that there. But moving back to the U.S. context here, I mean, you can say, I think back to when you and I were college students. This is in a very different era. You remember that I said and did some things that you were like, wow, Mike, you need to just, because I was well to the right of you. And
yes, yeah.
I said and did some stupid things. You can testify to this, right?
Some were pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But the point being is that there was no, like in the Harvard case, nobody funded a billboard truck driving by Baldwin Wallace's campus with my name and picture on it. In this case, this really happened with these people who signed the group, students who were not necessarily.
I couldn't find anybody to do it.
Well, I mean,
I tried. I mean,
we were on the same side back then. But I mean, think about this, right? Well, this conservative group funded a billboard truck to drive around the area of Harvard's campuses with saying Harvard's leading anti-Semites, and the names and pictures of the kids who not necessarily directly signed the statement, but who were part of groups that signed that statement. I mean, to me, that's pretty beyond the pale as well.
I would think so, but let's also, I'd say, if we're talking about, back in the day, you were never celebrating groups that murdered civilians.
That's true.
In particularly cruel ways, right?
Sure.
I mean, you would argue about tax policy and so and so's too squishy on defense, and I think there were times about we ought to bomb the hell out of X, Y, or Z, but I don't think you ever endorsed mass murder like is happening now. So no, do I let's put this, or do I think it's a fair or effective tactic? Probably not. No. Do I understand why conservative groups feel that way? Yeah. That someone, again, a student who uses the wrong pronoun can be subject to disciplinary action and expelled. A student who advocates in support of really barbarous stuff, gets a free ride.
But let's be clear here. Let's be clear here. It's not these students. I mean, the statement isn't advocating for killing children, for beheading children. It's saying that this violence had a cause, and it is not the fault of the people. It's an important distinction to make here. The statement didn't say we were gladdened at the death of Israeli civilians, or now something like that would be.
Maybe not that statement, but certainly some of the protests and some of the marches have made that point.
Sure, and I'm not talking about. I'm not going to get into individuals at marches or protests when I don't have access to that. I'm talking about the written statement that was the focus of that, where it's something concrete. And so it seems to me that, and maybe it's just part of our larger political culture or lack thereof at this day, where these days when it's simply impossible to show any sort of sympathy for the enemy, right? And you have to take sides. Something like Representative Tlaib, right, who immediately blamed Israel for the hospital bombing and refused to, push or to recant or to moderate her statement in any way, even when the best available intelligence evidence to this point suggests that it wasn't, in fact, Israeli forces that bombed that hospital, but, an errant rocket or something from Palestinian Hamas forces. And so that's the sort of thing I think we see too much of on both sides these days.
So, no, look, I would say I stand against, cancel culture across the board. So no, and I don't like the idea of doxing people, especially people who just happen to be in groups, signatories to the letter.
That's maybe different.
Maybe more fair game.
But I don't know about the whole doxing thing, especially in an age when that sort of thing very commonly, it seems like, leads to death threats and other sorts of actions. That really wasn't the case, I think, when that occasionally happened, a generation ago or so. No,
not at all. It was a weird thing. I mean, nobody, particularly a generation ago, no one would really care what goofy kids said or did on campus. You know what I mean?
There's that too. Yeah. So before we move on, any other thoughts on this? Anything that I didn't bring up that we missed before we get on to domestic politics?
Oh, I suppose there's all kinds of stuff, but
yeah.
we'll have this to talk about for a while. So.
Well, then let's turn to domestic politics. And the top story there would be that the House of Representatives still doesn't have a speaker after Jim Jordan, the leading Republican vote getter, couldn't wrangle a majority in 3 votes. In the first one, 20 Republicans voted for someone else. Then after that, 22 voted after someone else. And then just earlier today, before the third vote, Jordan held a news conference where it was kind of interesting. He talked about the Wright brothers and America, his favorite Bible verse. And there was a lot going on there, and then said he would continue his candidacy despite what seemed to be a near certainty of his losing more ground in the third vote. And that's exactly what happened. He lost 3 more votes. And then hours after that, and shortly before we started recording, it's reported that an internal House Republican caucus vote on whether or not Jordan should continue ended up with a majority saying, no, he shouldn't continue seeking the position of Speaker. And if it's not Jordan, it's unclear who can actually get to 217 of those 221 Republican votes. Initially, there was a thought of maybe giving more authority to acting Speaker Patrick McHenry. And by the way, I should point out that's one of my all-time favorite names for a Republican representative.
Right. Give him McLiberty or give him McDuff.
There you go. But it looks like that's a non-starter at this point. There are too many objections raised to it, some from McHenry himself, though it doesn't really seem likely, at least yet, that Republicans are going to turn to Democrats for support, because that would involve a number of concessions that they're, I think, nowhere near ready to seriously consider. So, Jay, are you surprised at all at how this has played out to this point? And also, where do you see things going from here?
Yeah, I don't know why you're having me on the podcast, is because I'm at a loss, right? If this was my area of expertise, I can't tell you what's going on. I don't get why at this point you just don't pick a speaker. I mean, look, to my mind, Scalise say he'd be fine, Jordan be fine. You just need to get somebody. This isn't picking a pope, right? Hell, he's probably not even going to be speaker in 2 years. Right. So, I mean, so to me, I think that we're getting to the point of someone's better than no one. And I don't get what what the fights are over at this point anymore, right?
I think I do. I think a lot of the moderate Republicans feel that a small rump group of Freedom Caucus folks have for too long exercised outsized influence, and especially when the conference decided on Scalise in a conference vote, and then a whole bunch of those folks refused to back him on the floor when they had decided, and then they said, oh no, we're going to back Jordan. And then I think those same moderates said, well, why should we go with your guy? He co-founded the group that's the cause of all this politics of hostage taking and so forth. And so if we're going to pick anyone, we're not going to pick a guy like that. If anyone should learn how to compromise, it's you folks in the far right of the Freedom Caucus and not us. And I think that's a reasonable point.
Yeah, fair enough. But at some point, you got to have enough votes for somebody. And my point is, you're better off with somebody than nobody, even if it's somebody that you don't like. I mean, you can always go back and try to rub the Freedom Caucus's nose in it later, or lessons learned later, or something. But
you can't.
Yeah,
I don't think you can, because I think finally the moderates are saying, you know what, we've given ground and given ground and given ground to these people, and we're not going to let them run our caucus. There are a number of them, but there aren't that many of them, at least not that many intransigent numbers of them, and we're not going to give them a win on this.
And that's the problem. And unless you can move, whatever, 4 or 5 of those folks, you just don't have the numbers. So,
and then at some point, maybe it becomes...
I'm not advocating for or saying I disagree, or I don't understand why they might be motivated to do that. I'm just saying, at some point, it's a little, like organizing the deck chairs on the Titanic type thing, right?
I don't disagree with that, but I don't think that if you're going to find somebody who is somewhat acceptable to 217 out of 220 Republicans, You don't pick somebody who has I would argue, a well-deserved reputation as a bomb-throwing, conspiracy theory pushing, John Boehner, former speaker, called him a legislative terrorist. This is not a guy who is well-positioned to be a moderating influence to get that sort of support. And so I think the very fact of putting him forward is basically trying to rub the majority of your caucus's face in that. And if I'm a moderate Republican, I think at this point I say, well, the hell with you guys.
Right. And they did.
And they did. And so what happens now, do you think? I mean, I know you said.
I don't know. That's what I'm saying. I got nothing.
But I mean, obviously this can't go on forever. I mean, at some point they're going to, and I guess I'm wondering, do you think, and I won't hold you to this because you already said you have no clue. And I think at this point, anyone who says they have a clue is full of it. To me, this talk about getting some Democrats on board with a really moderate-ish Republican in exchange for some concessions, I think that's just a negotiating tactic. If the Freedom Caucus folks feel like they try to get enough of those folks over, right, into supporting a Republican speaker. But, if this goes on for 2-3 more weeks, all of a sudden the rubber starts to meet the road and you got to do something. And I wonder, can you conceive of a world in which the majority of the Republican caucus would say, you know what, we'd rather find 5 Democratic votes than, or, however many Democratic votes, than get those votes from the Freedom Caucus?
I can conceive of that world of 5. I mean, this happened a number of times in the Ohio House, just over the past decade or so. In none of the cases was the outcome really good. In that case, it wasn't simply 5 Democrats. It was sort of the entire Democratic caucus joining with a part of the Republican caucus, and they probably elected Larry Householder, who, if people who don't follow these things, is now serving time. And now we've got a new speaker was sort of the same. There was the same sort of bipartisan. Now, again, there aren't any ethical hits on him yet, but it's the speakership's been kind of paralyzed. So no, I don't. I mean, maybe you can have a couple moderate Democrats who would come across, but I don't think. I don't see Democrats breaking ranks to do that.
Well, I think there might be some.
Party discipline is always much better among Democrats than Republicans.
Yeah, I mentioned 5. There are, I believe, 5 Democrats who are from districts that were carried by Trump, and maybe you can find a few more. But I think it would be difficult to get those votes. But we certainly can't be speakerless forever. But it made me think a lot about Jim Jordan, and he was a guest on the show. We've recently re-aired the interview that you did.
I heard that. Yes,
with him back in 2017, right? And I want to get your take, because it seems here's my take on Jim Jordan. If our expectation of legislators is that they legislate, that's not been Jordan's MO, right? He's been in the House since 2006. He has, by almost any measure that's ever been devised about legislative effectiveness, whether it's number of bills that have been co-sponsored, anything you can think of, he's been like rock bottom for a long time, right? And so it seems to me that Jim Jordan isn't interested in seriously legislating. He isn't at all interested in working with Democrats. I feel like, based on everything I know about him from his career in Congress, he wants to make a lot of noise, wants to blow things up. He's got a penchant for conspiracy theories, which I feel like came out at the end of your interview with him, even back then in 2017. He's a guy who said he didn't know how he could be convinced that Trump didn't actually win the election. I feel like he represents so much of what is wrong with American politics today. And I bet you have a very different view of him. And so I don't want to just I don't feel like it's trashing him. I'm just basing my opinion on what I can see. Maybe you can offer a different perspective.
So, yeah, I mean, for those who did listen to the interview or don't know, I mean, I worked with Jim Jordan early in my career, earlier in his career, when he was a freshman representative in the Ohio legislature. And I describe him as he's a friend, right? I mean, we don't hang out much anymore or anything like that. But,
he's kind of a busy guy, yeah.
Yeah, as am I, Mike. But no, I mean, look, he was someone who I had a good deal of respect for what he did in the legislature. He was I'll say this, throughout the time that I knew him, he's a decent human being to people he came in contact with, and good to his staff and to that sort of thing, right? He's so I'm coming at it from a little bit that perspective, and also I think I relayed the story maybe a couple weeks ago about the representative who was one time charged with you haven't done anything all these years you've been in office, haven't introduced any bills, and his response was bills, hell, I play defense. And I'll tell you, actually, that was the guy who Jim Jordan challenged in the primary. So I think Jordan kind of comes from that same position of I'm here to play defense. I'm not about introducing bills or legislating. I'm about stopping stuff from happening. Now you can take a couple different views of that and say, well, that's really not a good attitude to have, or you can say, look, that maybe that is the good attitude to have, right? The standing athwart history, shouting stop type thing, right? And regardless, I think there's a role for that person in a legislature. The ancient Roman Senate had Cato, right? Who would it was just kind of that sort of naysayer, always,
I guess, yeah,
against everything.
I see what you're saying, and I agree, but I would find it easier to agree if Jim Jordan were more of a consistent figure, like say a Thomas Massey, who I disagree with on so much, but I really respect Thomas Massey's integrity, even if I disagree with him very much on policy, right? And Jim Jordan, it seems to me, especially in the last couple of years, he has made a conscious decision to cozy up to leadership. He said a lot of things trying to get the speaker's gavel. Oh, yes, I want to push through this and that and other things, and I'm interested in working with people. And so it seems to me, and again, I don't know the man, but it seems to me that based on what I see from his actions, that Jim Jordan is willing to be whatever it takes to get as much power as he can get for himself. And if there's more to it than that, I have not seen it as of yet. And that's why I have a great deal of respect for you, but I have a lot of trouble having any respect for Jim Jordan.
So, I mean, I can say the only, I guess way to respond to that is the Jim Jordan that I knew back in the day wasn't the same like populist Trumpian type. Now, again, times were different, and it was maybe an easier, easier to stand just on pure principle, right? So it's hard to say there, and
I suppose you could look at it as who is the real Jim Jordan. The real Jim Jordan is who he started his career out as, and so when he saw the populist Trumpian wave, he latched onto it as a way to get into a position where he could finally become the person that he is, powerful enough to do good things. But and sometimes that works, but that sort of thinking oftentimes is very convenient for people who, give up principles temporarily, right? To try to, and sometimes people can pull it off.
And that's certainly not something that's uncommon in politics, right? That's kind of the par for the course, right? Is that the people who are exceptional are the ones who will say, no, I'm not going to give up principle for power. The idea, the temptation, right, is always if I can just get, this next thing, then I'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. And that's sort of the, again, you get into a weird, I guess it's sort of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Paradox of conservative leadership, right? That if you're real conservative, you kind of don't really want leadership. You eschew that. You view power in itself as corrupting, and yet you want to try to get in a position so that you can stop other people from gaining that power, and the only way to do that is to get in power yourself.
In which case you end up getting corrupted more often than not.
Therein lies the problem, right? Yeah. And I guess maybe the response, this is the philosophical response, sort of, is to say, well, then just don't get too attached to people. Put your faith in ideas. Right?
That sounds like a horrible way to win elections. I gotta say.
Right, exactly. Well, again, I mean, yeah, but no, I mean, taking a realistic view that all people are fallible, and you're never, and I think in general, Republicans probably do a better job of that, at least pre-Trump, than Democrats. Right? There was always the whole the thing about Obama and the getting the thrill down your leg and all this kind of stuff, and Republicans typically didn't have view politicians as a messiah, right? It's sort of they're all right, a capable manager and the lesser of two evils and that sort of thing.
And then with Trump, you literally had golden statues raised to the man. That's why I said pre-Trump. Exactly. No, I agree with you. Pre-Trump, definitely. Yeah, without a doubt.
It was again, the Republicans came out of the Whig Party. The Whigs who were anti-royal, the original Whigs, anti-royalist, right? And then the American Whigs, who viewed Andrew Jackson as sort of that, pretending to royalty kind of thing. There was that Whiggish tradition. But it's wasn't there in 2016 or 2020. So maybe a little bit in 2016, but not 2020.
In the end, I don't. Assuming this gets worked out within the next 3 weeks or so, I don't think it matters all that much. And I think there's a lot. Because I want to point. You wouldn't know that.
That was kind of my point as well. Look, somebody's better than nobody.
Yeah, and I think we'll eventually see somebody, and we'll end up.
Or maybe I should say anybody's better than nobody.
Well, if we want to go with anyone, let's go with the top vote getter, Hakeem Jeffries. I'll be behind that, but I don't think you would say he's better than nobody. But the point.
No, but in terms of the Republicans,
yeah.
Better than nobody.
But I think for your average voter, this is not going to be an issue in November or even in the primary election so much. And so it'll all get, it's almost been kind of amusing to me, I got to say, to see the reactions on X and some of the media reactions to this being the biggest thing in the world. It's the New York Times has been especially, to me, comical on this. I feel like they must have, there must be some sort of a staff directive that you cannot talk about the House Republican Party without inserting the word chaos somewhere into the sentence, And it's like, is it chaos? Really? I mean, I don't know. But at the same time, they'll talk about Congress at a standstill. So it's like a chaotic standstill. So I don't know. Just it's in a way, it's so much an inside the beltway kind of thing. And I think the only way it matters longer term is if the person who ends up as speaker is somebody who actually is hostile towards foreign aid, right? Who says, I'm not going to bring Ukraine aid to the floor. And we talked about this last time. You take a look at Jordan's record. He has not had a good record on Ukraine aid. And now maybe some of that, as you talked about before, maybe that's because free votes. It's easy to do that when you're not in leadership. But that's not necessarily the kind of thing you want to roll the dice on so much. But and
again, like I said, throughout his career, even in Ohio and throughout his congressional career, even though he moved up the ladder, he was always sort of a backbench bomb thrower type, right? That's where he thrived on. That's what he saw his role as being.
And I think in this culture, those are the sort of people who end up advancing the quickest. I mean, he's one of the best fundraisers in Congress because I think of his facility with that sort of thing. But honestly, I feel more comfortable with the Patrick McHenry types. And I guess you would probably feel more comfortable with them as well, temperamentally, or the John Boehner types.
The other thing that strikes me is the Jim Jordan that I know, or Jim Jordan that I knew, however you want to put it. I think he would be miserable as speaker.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you could talk about why.
Being speaker, being speaker, it not only entails policy stuff, but there's a whole lot of just administrative stuff, right? And again, it's all about rounding people up and kind of making compromises. And it would be sort of not at all what he would like to do. He seems to be, and again, through the time I've known him, much more about he'd rather be able to go out there and go down in a ball of flames on principle, right? Than to have to give up, some of that principle in order to score something. So, I think it'd be miserable, like putting together coalitions and that sort of thing.
I was a little bit surprised, not a lot surprised, but a little bit surprised when he decided not to run for Senate last time around. But maybe he was eyeing the next cycle, I thought, because I feel like that's a much better position for him. It's not so much a backbencher, but somebody, if he wants to get more power, right? The speakership, I agree, seems very ill-suited to him. Chairman of the judiciary, that seems like very well-suited to him. And I feel like, he initially...
And the word on the street that I had heard back when they were picking a speaker was that Jordan wasn't interested for that very reason. He wanted to be chairman of the judiciary.
And that seems to be a perfect fit for what he is best at. If you're a Democrat, you look at the other way, but it fits with his proclivities and inclinations and so forth. And so maybe this works out for the best. I don't know if we end up with Steve Scalise or somebody else. I should point out John Boehner got one vote on the second ballot there, that would be an interesting choice as well. I think he's
orange, rested, and ready. Yeah.
There you go. So, anyway, all right. Any other thoughts on the speaker race?
No. Again, like I said, okay. I got no clue.
But I predict we will have a speaker before the continuing resolution runs out. That's and within a couple of weeks. That's my bold prediction. What do you think? I'll end with a prediction.
I think that's probably a good prediction.
Okay, so maybe not a bold prediction, but a reasonable prediction. Well, all right. Well, we're about out of time. We haven't gotten to a whole bunch of things. Some guilty pleas in the Trump, or not the Trump, but the Georgia racketeering case involving the 2020 election. Senator Robert Menendez, who is just all about being an agent of Egypt, apparently. We'll talk about that. Presidential fundraising numbers, Joe Biden's media strategy, if you want to call it that. A lot of stuff we didn't get to now, but we will get to on the midweek show. That's one of the advantages you get of being a supporter of the Politics Guys, is you get the full midweek show. And so we hope to consider becoming a supporter. You don't just get that, you get ad-free episodes, that, like I said, that full-length midweek show, access to our Discord group, and even the opportunity, like a couple of listeners took this week, to listen in and comment as we record the show every week. And if you're interested in that, you can.
And I apologize for the delay in that, because I had to
fight for freedom.
Pause and go fight for freedom.
That's important.
For a while we had everybody else hanging on the line.
As I said, freedom isn't free. You don't want to know Jay's billable rate anyway. But if you want to find out more about any of that, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can support us on Venmo or at politicsguys or through PayPal. We always put the links in our show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you want to get that full-length midweek show, but you can't support us financially right now, send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make that happen for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you could subscribe rate and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And if you want to get in touch with us, we love hearing from listeners. There are lots of ways to do that. Email, mail@politicsguys.com. There's the Discord channel I already mentioned, as well as Facebook and X, and you'll find links to those in our show notes. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week. We hope you'll join us.